It's the dead of winter, in a city that once called itself the center of the world. Inside the ruins of an imperial palace, men are prying wooden beams down from the ceiling. Not soldiers looting an enemy, but the emperor's own servants. They stack the wood into a fireplace built for Caesars and set it alight. The man who gave the order is the reigning emperor of Constantinople. His name is Baldwin II, and he is burning his own palace just to stay warm. This is not a fallen ruler hiding from disaster. Baldwin is still, on paper, one of the most powerful men in the Christian world, heir to a Crusader dynasty that conquered the greatest city in Europe. Constantinople had 1,000 years of gold, silk, relics, and libraries. Whoever controlled it should have been rich beyond imagination. Instead, its emperor cannot afford a fire. How does that happen? How does the ruler of the most legendary city on earth end up burning furniture for heat, selling holy relics to strangers, and, as we'll see, even handing over his own son as security for a loan? This is the story of the Latin Empire of Constantinople, the empire that won the ultimate prize of the medieval world and spent 57 years discovering it couldn't afford to keep it. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 1202, decades before Baldwin was even born, to the launch of what became known as the Fourth Crusade. The plan was simple. A Christian army sails from Venice to Egypt, strikes at the heart of Muslim power there, and marches on from that base to liberate Jerusalem. That is not what happened. The Crusaders had a problem before they'd even left port. They didn't have enough money to pay Venice for the fleet of ships they had hired. Venice offered a deal: work off the debt by attacking Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast that had defied Venetian control. A crusade meant to fight for Christendom had just been redirected to attack a Christian city instead. The Pope was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade for the attack on Zara. But the army still had no money and nowhere else to go. And that's when a new opportunity appeared. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, whose father had been overthrown and blinded, offered an enormous reward if the Crusaders would simply help him seize the throne of Constantinople. Money the Crusaders desperately needed. A city more fabulously wealthy than any in Western Europe. The offer was simply too good to refuse. In 1203, the Crusader fleet sailed for Constantinople, not to fight against Muslim armies, but to install a new Byzantine emperor by force. The plan collapsed almost immediately. The prince they installed couldn't pay what he had promised. The Byzantine treasury turned out to be nearly empty, and the Byzantine public despised him as a Latin puppet. By early 1204, the Crusaders were stranded outside the walls of Constantinople, unpaid, unwelcome, and rapidly running out of options. So the Crusades' leaders made a decision that would define the next 6 decades of Mediterranean history. If Constantinople would not pay them what it owed, they would simply take the city and rule it themselves. On April 12, 1204, Crusader forces broke through Constantinople's defenses. What followed was 3 days of looting so severe that historians still call it one of the great heists of history. Churches were stripped of gold and silver. Ancient bronze statues were melted down for coin. The famous bronze horses of the Hippodrome were carried off to Venice, where you can still see them today. A city that had stood as the capital of the Roman world for nearly 900 years, that had survived sieges by Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus, had finally fallen. Not to a foreign army from beyond the borders of Christendom, to a crusade that was supposed to be fighting somewhere else entirely. With the city in their hands, the Crusade's leaders needed to decide who would rule it. They chose Baldwin IX, Count of Flanders, crowned inside the Hagia Sophia as the first Latin Emperor of Constantinople. On paper, he now ruled one of the greatest cities on earth. In practice, he ruled a disaster. The new Latin Empire was carved up between rival Crusader lords and the Venetians, each claiming their own slice of former Byzantine territory. There was no unified state, only a patchwork of competing Latin lordships loosely acknowledging an emperor with almost no real authority beyond the capital's own walls. And the Byzantines had not simply disappeared. Greek nobles who fled the sack regrouped and founded rival successor states of their own. The Empire of Nicaea across the straits, the Despotate of Epirus to the west, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Every single one of them considered the Latin emperor an occupier, and every single one of them wanted Constantinople back. Baldwin I did not even survive his first year in any meaningful sense. He marched against the Bulgarians in 1205, was catastrophically defeated at the Battle of Adrianople and was taken prisoner. He was never seen again. The first Latin Emperor of Constantinople vanished as a captive within a year of his own coronation. This is the pattern that would define the entire Latin Empire for the next half-century. Constant war on every border, with no reliable way to pay for any of it. Byzantine successor states pressed in from the east. Bulgaria pressed from the north. And Venice, technically an ally, was mostly just extracting trade privileges and territory for itself. The Latin Empire had not inherited Byzantium's wealth. It had inherited Byzantium's enemies without Byzantium's resources to fight them. Here is the part most people get wrong about conquests like this one. Controlling a famous city is not the same as controlling its wealth. Constantinople's riches had come from centuries of trade networks, careful tax administration, and a functioning bureaucracy, all of which the Crusaders had just violently dismantled during the sack itself. They had killed the golden goose to grab a handful of eggs. Within a few years, Constantinople's population had collapsed, its trade networks had collapsed, and the tax base any Latin emperor needed to fund an army simply was not there anymore. Every Latin emperor who followed Baldwin I inherited the same impossible math: a shrinking treasury, shrinking territory, and enemies who never stopped attacking. By the 1220s, the Latin Empire controlled little more than Constantinople itself and a thin, contested strip of land around it, which brings us to the man history remembers as the last Latin emperor, Baldwin II of Courtenay. He inherited the throne as a child in 1228 and would rule, if you can even call it that, for the next 33 years. Baldwin spent much of his reign not in Constantinople, but on the road, traveling across Western Europe, kingdom to kingdom, begging kings and popes for money and soldiers to save what was left of his empire. In 1236, again in 1245. He was, in effect, the medieval world's most desperate fundraiser, and he happened to be Emperor of Constantinople. And when the begging trips weren't enough, Baldwin turned to the one asset his empire still had left: the sacred relics looted from Byzantine churches back in 1204. The most valuable of them all was the Crown of Thorns, believed to be the very crown placed on Christ at the crucifixion. In 1238, Baldwin sold it. The buyer was King Louis IX of France. Louis was so moved by acquiring it that he built an entire church just to house it, the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, one of the most beautiful buildings of the entire Gothic age. It still stands today, a monument that exists because an emperor of Constantinople needed cash so badly that he sold Christianity's most sacred relic to the King of France. But the relic sales were nowhere near enough. The Latin Empire's territory kept shrinking, its garrisons kept shrinking, and Baldwin kept running out of money. So he started stripping the city itself. Lead sheeting from the roofs of Constantinople's grandest buildings, some of them centuries old, was torn off and sold as scrap metal. Roof by roof, Baldwin sold off the physical fabric of the very city he ruled. With no roofs left, the buildings beneath were exposed to rain and decay. Structures that had survived since the age of Justinian began to collapse, not from war, not from siege, but from simple neglect and asset stripping by their own emperor. And still, it was not enough. At some point during his reign, with his treasury completely empty and winter setting in, chroniclers record that Baldwin had timber and roof beams torn from the imperial palace itself and burned for firewood. The Emperor of Constantinople, heir to the throne of Constantine and Justinian, was breaking apart his own palace just to stay warm. And when even that was not enough to secure a loan from Venetian merchants, Baldwin handed over the one thing he had left of real value. His own son, Philip, sent away as a living guarantee against the debt. Think about that for a moment. He sold the holiest relic in Christendom. He stripped the lead from his own roofs. He burned his own palace for fuel. He pawned his own child. This is not the caricature of a decadent emperor squandering wealth. This is a man who had sold everything else and had nothing left but himself. By the late 1250s, the Latin Empire was barely an empire at all. It controlled little more than the walls of Constantinople and whatever soldiers Baldwin could scrape together in any given year. Meanwhile, across the straits, the Empire of Nicaea, the strongest of the Byzantine successor states, had spent decades rebuilding a real army, a real treasury, and a real claim to be the legitimate continuation of Byzantium. Its new emperor, Michael VIII Palaiologos, was patient. He didn't need to storm Constantinople. He only needed to wait for the right moment. That moment came in July of 1261. The Latin Empire's small garrison, along with its allied Venetian fleet, was away on campaign, chasing a minor military target far from the capital. Constantinople, the most fortified city in the medieval world, had been left almost undefended. A Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos learned of this by accident through local scouts. He recognized an opportunity too good to pass up and gathered a small force to test the city's defenses. His men found an unguarded gate and slipped inside under cover of night. There was barely a fight. Constantinople, a city so significant that an entire crusade had once been diverted just to seize it, fell back into Byzantine hands in a matter of hours with almost no bloodshed at all. Baldwin II fled the city on a Venetian ship, barely escaping with his life. He would die in exile years later, still calling himself emperor of a city he would never see again. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was over. 57 years after the Fourth Crusade first breached its walls, the empire it created collapsed. Not in one final dramatic battle, but through an accident of bad timing, following decades of decay that had already hollowed the empire out from the inside. Byzantine rule was restored under Michael VIII, but the empire he reclaimed was not the empire the Crusaders had destroyed back in 1204. Constantinople's population, wealth, and infrastructure never fully recovered from those 57 years of Latin rule and neglect. The restored Byzantine Empire limped on for nearly 2 more centuries, poorer, smaller, and increasingly unable to defend itself. In 1453, almost 200 years after Michael's reconquest, a far stronger enemy would finally finish what the Fourth Crusade had started. The Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople for good, ending the Roman Empire nearly 1,000 years after Constantine had built it. Historians still debate how much of that final collapse traces back to the wound the Fourth Crusade inflicted in 1204. There is a lesson in the Latin Empire that goes beyond the medieval world. Conquering something valuable is not the same as being able to sustain it. Baldwin II's crown gave him a title. It never gave him an economy, a loyal population, or a plan. An empire built purely on extraction, with nothing to replace what it had destroyed, was never going to survive contact with reality. The next time you hear about a conqueror seizing the ultimate prize, remember Baldwin II, sitting in a stripped, roofless palace, burning the last of his own furniture for warmth, having already sold the Crown of Thorns and given away his own son. He held the biggest crown in the medieval world, and it cost him everything he actually had. So here's a question worth sitting with. How many empires, or even lives, look powerful from the outside while quietly burning through everything meant to sustain them?